Topic 10. International Conflicts and Crises in the 20th Century, Part 2. The Cold War and the Post-Cold War Period. History GPS. International situation during and after the Cold War. The Cold War, from 1946 to 1991, began after the end of the Second World War. During the war, the United States and the Soviet Union led opposing camps and confronted each other. The Cold War triggered many crises, and world peace was yet to come. In 1991, the breakup of the Soviet Union ended the Cold War. The United States became the only superpower in the post-Cold War period. At the same time, the influence of some regional forces and emerging economies grew. Moreover, frequent regional crises and terrorist activities still threatened world peace. Topic Inquiry. What were the major conflicts during the Cold War? What were the changes in the international situation after the end of the Cold War? 1. Start of the Cold War. After the end of the Second World War, the European powers went into decline. Their leading position was taken over by the United States and the Soviet Union. The wartime alliance between the two countries broke down because of the different ideologies and ideas about post-war arrangements. The Cold War started. 2. Development of the Cold War. During the Cold War, the American-led capitalist bloc and the Soviet-led communist bloc confronted each other for many years. Though there were some serious crises, no direct military conflicts or nuclear war broke out between the United States and the Soviet Union. There were also periodic détentes, but American-Soviet conflict never ended. 3. End of the Cold War and the post-Cold War period. From 1989 to 1991, the Communist bloc and the Soviet Union successfully dissolved. The Cold War ended peacefully. After that, the international situation changed from American-Soviet confrontation to American domination of world affairs. With the rise of the European Union, China and India, the world was moving towards multipolarity. At the same time, world peace was threatened by regional crisis and terrorism. Look at the timeline of events. 1946-1953. Outbreak and early development of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union formed their respective camps to confront each other. They also intervened in local conflicts. 1953-1960. The first détente. The United States and the Soviet Union improved relations. 1960-1971. Continuation of the Cold War. Many conflicts broke out between the United States and the Soviet Union. They also intervened in local conflicts. 1971-1979. The second détente. The United States and the Soviet Union improved relations. 1979-1985. Recurrence of the Cold War. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Relations between the United States and the Soviet Union worsened again. 1985-1999. End of the Cold War. The Soviet leader Gorbachev introduced reforms leading to the fall of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. History Starter. 1. The traditional European powers further declined after the Second World War. The United States and the Soviet Union rose to become superpowers and confronted each other. A new world order was formed. 2. The United States developed the world's first atomic bomb during the Second World War. The US dollar became the world currency in the post-war period. The country was superior in military and economic strength. 3. The the Soviet Union expanded its armaments during the latter stages of the Second World War. It also required a lot of resources from Eastern Europe after liberating it from Nazi rule. It became a great economic and military power. 4. The United States and the Soviet Union practiced capitalism and communism respectively. There were disputes and mistrust between them. When the Soviet Union set up satellite states in Eastern Europe, the American-Soviet wartime alliance ended. 5. As a result, the United States and the Soviet Union formed rival blocs and confronted each other between 1946 and 1991. The two blocs were the US-led capitalist bloc and the Soviet-led communist bloc. Their confrontation was known as the Cold War. 6. The two blocs confronted each other in different fields and pushed the world to the brink of a nuclear war. However, there was no direct fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union. 7. In 1991, the breakup of the Soviet Union ended the Cold War. The United States became the only superpower. Some emerging regional forces, such as the European Union, China, and India, also became influential. 8. Although the strife between the two superpowers ended, ongoing regional conflicts and terrorist activities still put the world under the threat of war. A. Background and causes of the Cold War. Guiding questions. What were the features of the Cold War? What were the background and causes of the Cold War? 1. What was the Cold War? The Cold War was not a direct military conflict. It refers to the tense relations and confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union from 1946 to 1991. After the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union dominated international affairs. However, the relations grew worse, which eventually sparked the Cold War. During the Cold War, the United States led the capitalist bloc while the Soviet Union led the communist bloc. The two blocs confronted each other, but no direct war broke out between them. The Cold War gradually turned into a global conflict. It ended peacefully when the Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991. History Extra. Where did the term Cold War come from? In May 1945, the Soviet Union established pro-Soviet communist governments in Eastern Europe. In October, the British writer Orwell stated that there were ideological conflicts between the Soviet Union and the Western countries. He also used the term Cold War to describe the state of a constant threat of nuclear war. This term was further adopted by American politicians to describe the confrontation between the American bloc and the Soviet bloc. In 1947, the American writer Lippmann published an important work, The Cold War, popularizing the term Cold War. 2. Background. Rise of the New World Order. The traditional European powers were seriously weakened by the Second World War. The United States and the Soviet Union rose to become superpowers and dominated international affairs. They competed for world leadership and confronted each other. A new world order developed. A. Decline of traditional European powers. 1. War damage and casualties. Europe was the main battlefield during the Second World War. Numerous cities were destroyed and countless civilians lost their homes. Farmland, factories, and infrastructure were ruined. For example, 2/3 of the railways in France were damaged. The war caused heavy casualties as well. The traditional European powers' death toll amounted to 10 million. Many people were also disabled by the war, resulting in a sharp decrease in the labor force. Many resources were also needed for post-war reconstruction. Look at the source 10.1. Deaths in Germany, France, Britain, and Italy in the Second World War, above, and an oil painting of the Battle of Kursk in 1943, below, in which over 1 million soldiers were killed or wounded. 2. Decline in production and foreign trade. After the war, Europe's gained output was only half of that before the war, and industrial output was only 1/3, causing a food and resource crisis. Inflation was serious. European export trade dropped significantly. Unemployment rose when many soldiers were demobilized. Britain and France intended to acquire cheap resources from the colonies to increase productivity, but their plan failed with the start of decolonization. As a result, their economic difficulties remained unsolved. The government lacked money to carry out reconstruction. 3. War debts and reparations. European countries participating in the Second World War used their gold reserves and issued bonds to raise funds for the war. In the post-war period, defeated countries such as Germany and Italy needed to pay huge indemnities. Britain and France, which won the war, also had to repay huge war debts. The economic strength of the traditional European powers was severely weakened by the war, making the reconstruction progress slow. They could no longer dominate world affairs, but mainly follow their creditor, the United States, in the foreign policy. Look at the table describing the decline of the traditional European powers after the war. Britain. The British colonial empire began to fall apart. Between 1947 and 1948, India, Burma, and Ceylon, present-day Sri Lanka, declared independence. Britain also withdrew from Egypt and ended its trusteeship in Palestine. Britain borrowed heavily during the war. Debt repayment became a great problem. The war hit Britain's industrial production. Unemployment worsened when soldiers returned to the job market. More than 2.3 million people were unemployed. France. Frequent changes of the ruling party provoked a series of political crises. France's attempt to resume colonial rule in Southeast Asia, but met with strong local resistance. The anti-colonial wars lasted many years, making it impossible for France to focus on economic reconstruction. France was heavily exploited under German occupation. Resources were therefore in shortage after the war. Furthermore, industrial and agricultural production stopped due to the destruction of railways, factories, and farmland. Germany. A large piece of land in eastern Germany was given to the Soviet Union and Poland. The land was about 1/4 of Germany's territory in 1937. Germany was the main battlefield. Numerous houses, factories, and farmlands were damaged. Furthermore, the Soviet Union took many resources from its German occupation zone and expelled millions of Germans. Unemployment and inflation worsened. Italy. Italy had to give up its overseas colonies and sea territories to France and Greece. There were frequent changes of government after the end of fascist rule. Political instability led to nationwide protests and riots. The war seriously damaged railways, factories, and farmland. The cost of reconstruction was huge. Due to the damage and the political and social instability, post-war industrial and agricultural production was only 1/3 of the pre-war level. B. Rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers. 1. Rise of the United States. The United States joined the two world wars only at a later stage, and it was not a major battlefield. Also, during the First World War, the United States also grabbed export market share from the European countries. Therefore, it became a world economic power in the 1920s. Between 1933 and 1943, the United States experienced rapid economic growth. The US dollar even became the dominant world currency after the Second World War. In 1945, it became the first country to successfully develop the atomic bomb. After the two world wars, the United States became an economic and military superpower. 2. Rise of the Soviet Union. During the First World War, Russian communists set up the first communist regime in history and established the Soviet Union in 1922. Starting in the 1920s, the Soviet Union focused on developing its heavy industry. It also vigorously developed its military industry because of international isolation and the threat of Nazi Germany. By 1938, the Soviet Union had become the world's third largest industrial country after the United States and Germany. The Soviet Union received huge compensation after the Second World War and extended its influence throughout Eastern Europe. It replaced the traditional powers like Britain and France as another superpower. Look at the source 10.2. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the Soviet Union was still able to mobilize nearly 12 million troops and had a powerful tank force. History in depth. Superpowers. The term superpowers was first introduced in the 1930s. They were the leading powers which had stronger military power and greater influence on international affairs than other powers. In 1944, Professor Fox wrote that the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union were superpowers. As superpowers, they had to shoulder the responsibility of maintaining world peace. The term superpowers then became popular in international diplomacy. With the decline of British power after the Second World War, only the United States and the Soviet Union were called superpowers during the Cold War. Look at the source 10.3. A world map after the end of the Second World War. At that time, Britain still had many colonies. However, with decolonization and problems with post-war reconstruction, Britain lost its position as a superpower during the Cold War. 3. Causes. American-Soviet confrontation. A. Ideological differences. The capitalist countries, led by the United States, stressed democracy, freedom, and human rights. They criticized communism for its lack of democracy and violations of individual freedom and private property rights. They strove to resist the expansion of communism. The communist countries, led by the Soviet Union, accused capitalism of class exploitation. They advocated a world revolution to build a classless society. Ideological differences caused suspicion and confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, paving the way for the start of the Cold War. Look at the source 10.4. Comparison of capitalism and communism. Politics. For capitalism, that represented by the United States and included most Western European countries. Democratic government based on free elections. Different parties could take part in politics. For communism, represented by the Soviet Union and included most Eastern European countries. The ruling Communist Party practiced one-party system. Economy. For capitalism, a free market economy, private ownership and protection of property rights. For communism, a centrally planned economy, public ownership of all means of production. Society. For capitalism, individualism, people enjoyed different kinds of freedom. For communism, collectivism, aimed to establish a classless society. Foreign relations. For capitalism, to resist the spread of communism. For communism, to push forward the world revolution. B. Long-standing mistrust. Ideological differences led to long mutual distrust between the United States and the Soviet Union. During the Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1922, American support for anti-communists upset the Russian communists. Russia was also displeased when it was not invited to the post-war Paris Peace Conference, which allowed the independence of the Eastern European countries from its rule. The signing of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact in the late 1930s also raised suspicion among the Western countries towards the Soviet Union. During the Second World War, the Soviet Union joined the Allied powers but was dissatisfied with the inadequate support from the United States. Moreover, as the United States concealed the development of the atomic bomb, the Soviet Union became uneasy. The short-term wartime alliance did not improve the relations between the two countries, but deepened their mutual suspicion instead. Source 10.5. American soldiers set to support the anti-communist forces in Russia in 1918. Look at the source 10.6. American and Soviet soldiers met at the Elbe River in April 1945. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union broke down soon after the end of the Second World War. C. Wartime differences. During the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union already had many disagreements over post-war arrangements at the wartime conferences. For example, at the Yalta Conference, the United States proposed holding democratic elections in the Eastern European countries and sought to establish pro-Western governments. The Soviet Union wanted to establish pro-Soviet communist regimes there to create a buffer zone between Germany and itself and to expand its power. At the Potsdam Conference, the United States proposed rebuilding the economy of Germany, whereas the Soviet Union demanded huge indemnities so as to weaken Germany permanently. D. Post-war confrontation. Though the United States and the Soviet Union were allies in the Second World War, their relationship was not solid from the start. Once their common enemy was gone, the long-standing differences could end their alliance at any time. After the Second World War, both the United States and the Soviet Union aimed to increase their influence and dominate international affairs. When the Soviet Union expanded in Eastern Europe, the United States was determined to stop its expansion. The wartime alliance broke down. The Cold War started. Look at the table of wartime conferences. 1. Moscow Conference, October-November 1943. The United States proposed giving China world power status. It wanted to turn China into an ally in Asia to counterbalance the Soviet Union in the future. The Soviet Union expressed strong opposition. Though it was persuaded to accept the proposal, it became more suspicious of the United States. 2. Dumbarton Oaks Conference, August-October 1944. The United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China discussed the structure and work of the United Nations. The Soviet Union proposed that its member republics should become founding members of the United Nations. The permanent members of the Security Council, with the Soviet Union included, should have veto power. They aimed to prevent the United Nations from tilting towards the American camp. There was no consensus about the proposal. American-Soviet enmity deepened. 3. Yalta Conference, February 1945. As early as October 1944, Britain privately agreed to give the Soviet Union control over most of Eastern Europe after the war. The aim was to strengthen the Soviet Union determination to fight against Germany. The United States believed that the agreement should be decided by the newly established United Nations. This made the Soviet Union discontented. Finally, the Soviet Union promised to hold elections in Eastern Europe after liberation. It aimed to take the chance to set up pro-Soviet communist regimes. 4. Potsdam Conference, July-August 1945. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union mainly dealt with the post-war arrangements for Germany, Japan, and Europe. The Soviet Union argued that Germany should pay it a war indemnity of $10 billion for its huge losses in the Second World War. The United States opposed devastating the post-war economy of Germany so as not to repeat the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles of 1919. B. Major developments of the Cold War. Guiding questions. What were the different stages of the Cold War? What were the features of each stage? What were the major events during the Cold War period? Both the capitalist bloc and the communist bloc wanted to overwhelm the other. This resulted in many crises which threatened world peace. 1. 1946-1953. Outbreak and early development. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union confronted each other by providing economic aid, forming military organizations, and intervening in local conflicts with force. The United States also adopted the containment policy as its basic strategy towards the communist bloc. A. Iron Curtain Speech, 1946. After the Second World War, the Soviet Union set up pro-Soviet communist regimes in Eastern Europe. In a speech in 1946, former British Prime Minister Churchill accused the Soviet Union of building the Iron Curtain across Europe with its control over Eastern European countries. He believed that Western countries should unite to stop Soviet expansion. American President Truman agreed with him. Look at the source 10.7. Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe after the Second World War above, and an extract from Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, right. An Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie the capitals of Eastern Europe, in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject to control from Moscow. Stalin argued that establishing pro-Soviet regimes in Eastern Europe was done only to safeguard the security of the Soviet Union. He accused Churchill of aiming to provoke war. After the Iron Curtain speech, the wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western countries ended. The Cold War began. History in depth. Satellite states. Eastern Europe under Soviet control. The Soviet Union established communist regimes in Eastern Europe, using them as a buffer against Western attacks. The internal and external affairs of these countries were controlled by the Soviet Union. The West called them Soviet satellite states as they regarded the Soviet Union as the leader and acted like satellites orbiting a planet. Independent and autonomous Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was the sole independent communist state in Eastern Europe. It had a strong army and thus was not threatened by the Soviet Union and the Soviet-led camp. After breaking off relations with the Soviet Union in 1948, Yugoslavia maintained trade relations with the West and accepted American aid. Look at the source 10.8. Stalin's response to Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in 1946. Mr. Churchill now takes the stand of the warmongers. The Soviet Union's loss of life has been several times greater than that of Britain and the United States put together. And so, the Soviet Union, anxious for its future safety, is trying to see that governments loyal to the Soviet Union should exist in these countries. How can anyone describe these peaceful aspirations of the Soviet Union as expansionist tendencies? From the source Study source 10.8. How did Stalin defend the Soviet Union's establishment of satellite states in Eastern Europe? B. Truman Doctrine, 1947. In 1946, a civil war broke out between the Greek government and the communists. At the same time, the Soviet Union put pressure on Turkey to open the Turkish Straits to Soviet warships and sea territories. The United States feared that the two countries would become pro-Soviet. In 1947, American President Truman announced that the United States would help countries that were threatened by communism. This was known as the Truman Doctrine. As a result of American help, the governments of Greece and Turkey successfully stopped the expansion of communism in their countries. C. Marshall Plan, 1947. In 1947, the United States introduced the Marshall Plan to provide economic aid to European countries. The United States believed that if Europe's economy improved, the people would not support communism. The plan helped Western European countries rebuild their economies and stopped the expansion of communism. It also strengthened their ties with the United States. D. Molotov Plan, 1947. The Soviet Union forbade the communist countries in Eastern Europe to join the plan. It also introduced the Molotov Plan to aid Eastern Europe, aiming to counterbalance the Marshall Plan and tighten control over the satellite states. The Molotov Plan and the Marshall Plan divided Europe into two economic blocs, deepening American-Soviet hostility. Look at the source 10.9, an extract from President Truman's speech in March 1947. I believe that it must be the policy of the US to support free peoples. Should we fail to aid Greece and Turkey, the effort will be far-reaching to the West as well as to the East. We must take immediate and resolute action. From the source, study source 10.9. According to Truman, what would be the result if the United States did not support Greece and Turkey? Look at the source 10.10. American Secretary of State Marshall above and Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs Molotov below. Data-based. Question 1. Aim: to understand the economic plans of the United States and the Soviet Union. Level 3. Interpreting sources and using your own knowledge and understanding. Study the source below and answer the questions that follow. Source A. Speech by the Soviet representative at the United Nations in May 1947. The plan will mean placing European countries under the economic and political control of the United States. Moreover, this plan is an attempt to form a bloc of several European countries hostile to the interests of the Eastern Europe and most particularly to the interests of the Soviet Union. Historical skills, attitudes, and language. Attitude refers to an author's feeling about a matter. Students can use positive, negative, optimistic, pessimistic, support, opposition, etc. to describe the attitude. Students can find clues in the language used by an author. For example, if an author uses warmonger to describe someone, it shows that he has a negative attitude towards him. Source B. A British cartoon published in 1948. B. Berlin Blockade, 1948-1949. 1. Background. In accordance with the Potsdam Agreement, 1945, Germany and Berlin were each divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. As Berlin was within the Soviet zone, the Soviet Union felt threatened by West Berlin, the occupation zones of the other 3 countries. In April 1948, the United States, Britain, and France planned to merge their occupation zones and jointly reconstruct Germany. the Soviet Union feared that a revived Germany would threaten its security again and capitalism would expand to its occupation zone. Therefore, it decided to force the Western powers out of West Berlin. 2. Development. In June 1948, the Soviet Union closed all land and water routes into West Berlin. In response, the Western powers sent supplies to West Berlin by air. In April 1949, the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European countries formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Faced with the united military strength of NATO, the Soviet Union extended the blockade in May 1949. Look at the source 10.11. The Administration of Berlin and the Berlin Blockade, 1948-1949. 3. Impact. Division of Germany. In May 1949, the United States, Britain, and France merged their German occupation zones to form the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. The United States believed that a strong West Germany could resist Soviet expansion into Western Europe. In October 1949, the Soviet Union turned its zone into the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. Germany was not reunified until 1990. 2 rival military blocs. During the Berlin blockade, 12 Western countries formed NATO to confront the Soviet Union. The founding of NATO showed that the United States had abandoned isolationism. It led the operations of NATO and could station troops and deploy missiles in member states. In May 1955, West Germany joined NATO. In response, the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Treaty Organization with its satellite states. Europe was then divided into 2 rival military blocs. Look at the source 10.12. Besides important resources, the United States and Britain also airlifted candy and chocolates to children. The Berlin airlift successfully saved the lives of the residents of West Berlin. It was regarded as a great victory for the capitalist bloc. Look at the source 10.13. Members of NATO and the Warsaw Treaty Organization, 1949-1982. History in depth. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. According to the North Atlantic Treaty signed in 1949, an attack on a member country was to be seen as an attack on all members of the organization, and NATO would respond as a whole. The Soviet Union believed that NATO was not purely a defensive organization, as it claimed. At the end of the Cold War, NATO had only carried out one non-military operation during the First Gulf War, 1990-1991. In the post-Cold War period, it was more active during the Yugoslav Civil War, 1991-1999. It carried out military operations and provided humanitarian aid to war refugees. Look at the source 10.14. NATO providing humanitarian aid during the Yugoslav Civil War. F. Establishment of the People's Republic of China, 1949. 1. Background. Shortly after the end of the Second World War, the Chinese Civil War, 1946-1949, broke out. The Soviet Union supported the Communists, led by Mao Zedong. The United States supported the nationalists, led by Jiang Jiechi. It aimed to stop the spread of communism in Asia. 2. Development. The Chinese Civil War ended with victory for the Communists. In October 1949, the People's Republic of China was founded. In December 1949, the nationalists retreated to Taiwan. 3. Impact. The establishment of the People's Republic of China showed that communism had spread to Asia. In 1950, China signed a mutual assistance treaty with the Soviet Union and joined the Communist bloc. These events concerned the United States. It thus continued to support the nationalists in Taiwan. Sino-American relations remained tense until the early 1970s. The United States believed that communism would spread further in Asia. It started to directly intervene in military conflicts in Asia, such as Korean War, from 1950 to 1953. Look at the source 10.15. In October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong announced the establishment of the People's Republic of China at Tiananmen Square, Beijing. G. Korean War, from 1950 to 1953. 1. Background. After the Second World War, the Korean Peninsula was divided into American and Soviet occupation zones along the 38th parallel. In 1947, the United Nations passed a resolution allowing Koreans to elect a new government. In July 1948, Syngman Rhee was elected president in the American occupation zone. He founded the Republic of Korea, South Korea. The Soviet Union then supported Kim Il-sung to found the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, in its occupation zone. Both South Korea and North Korea claimed sovereignty over the entire Korean peninsula. 2. Development. In June 1950, the Korean War started. UN forces pushed the North Koreans back to north of the 38th parallel and even advanced further north. This threatened the national security of China. In response, China sent a volunteer army to help North Korea. The war became a stalemate. In 1953, an armistice was signed. Look at the source 10.16. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 above, and MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief of the UN forces below. MacArthur did not follow Truman's order to fight a limited war. Eventually, he was relieved of his command. 3. Impact. The Korean Peninsula was still divided after the war. South Korea and North Korea remained hostile. After its involvement, China built up close relations with North Korea and its status in the Asian Communist movement rose. It continued to confront the United States and Asia. Since communism did not spread to South Korea, the United States saw the result of the war as a success of the containment policy. It grew more determined to contain communism in Asia. In addition to stationing American soldiers in South Korea, it also signed defense treaties with Japan and established the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization with several countries in 1954. Look at the source 10.17. Osan Air Base in South Korea in the late 1950s. The base was built by the United States during the Korean War. It is still in service today. History Extra. Scary Panmunjom. Panmunjom is a village on the 38th parallel. On July 27, 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed there. Since then, Panmunjom and the Berlin War, see page 134, have been seen as symbols of the Cold War. Panmunjom lies within a demilitarized zone. It is, however, strictly guarded and only people with special permits are allowed inside. Former American President Clinton once remarked that Panmunjom was the scariest place on earth. Look at the source 10.18. The joint security area in Panmunjom is guarded by both North Front and South Back Korean soldiers. History Extended. Historical figures representing different stages in the Cold War. Winston Churchill. Dates during the Cold War. In 1946, Churchill made his famous Iron Curtain speech, which quickly worsened the relations between the Soviet Union and the Western countries. It was regarded as a landmark event of the start of the Cold War. In 1951, Churchill became Prime Minister again. He consolidated the Anglo-American alliance and also urged the United States and the Soviet Union to conduct arm limitation talks. His anti-Soviet ideas and policies led to continuous tensions in the Cold War. Leadership qualities. Churchill was sagacious. He accurately foresaw East-West confrontation in the post-Second World War period. Moreover, he realized that a weak Western Europe could not resist Soviet expansion and feared that the United States would return to isolationism. Therefore, he made a warning in his Iron Curtain speech, reminding Western countries led by the United States to take action against Soviet expansion. Churchill was persuasive. His Iron Curtain speech aroused widespread concern in the West. The United States seized the opportunity and proposed the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. As a result, Western European countries achieved rapid economic recovery and avoided becoming Soviet satellite states like the Eastern European countries. Historical figures representing different stages in the Cold War. Mao Zedong. Deeds during the Cold War. Mao Zedong adopted the leaning to one side pro-Soviet policy after 1949 and intervened in the Korean War. This drove Sino-American confrontation. The Cold War tensions were intensified. In the late 1960s, Sino-Soviet relations worsened rapidly. Mao sought American support to counterbalance the Soviet Union. In 1971, he approved a visit of the American table tennis team to Beijing. This ping-pong diplomacy improved Sino-American relations and helped ease Cold War tensions. Leadership qualities. Mao was persevering and charismatic. As a communist supporter, he led the Communist Revolution in China and founded the People's Republic of China. He also provided aid to foreign communists, including in Korea and Vietnam. Millions of Chinese people joined the People's Volunteer Army in the Korean War in response to his call. This showed Mao's charisma. Mao was also adaptive. China was diplomatically isolated after the Sino-Soviet split. In view of this, Mao decisively changed the anti-American policy. Through the ping-pong diplomacy, China improved relations with the United States and avoided confrontation with the two superpowers at the same time. It also paved the way for China's return to the world political arena. In 1971, China restored all the lawful rights in the United Nations. China took an important step towards becoming a world power. 2. 1953-1960. The first détente. American-Soviet relations deteriorated after 1946. In 1953, new leaders came into power in both countries. They adjusted their foreign policies to ease tensions. However, mutual suspicion and enmity remained between them. A. Background of the détente. Leadership changes. 1. Eisenhower and his policies. In 1953, Eisenhower became the American president. He stressed that the United States must prevent the spread of communism in the world and avoid the domino effect. See source 10.19. At that time, the United States and the Soviet Union had both developed the hydrogen bomb, which was more powerful than the atomic bomb. To prevent a nuclear war, Eisenhower knew that the United States must avoid serious conflict with the Soviet Union. Therefore, he also advocated maintaining diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. Look at the source 10.19. Eisenhower and his domino theory. Eisenhower's domino theory. With the changes in China and the Korean Peninsula, if Vietnam fell under communist control, other Southeast Asian countries would follow. If Southeast Asia fell under communist control, Japan and the Philippines and Australia would follow. From the source. Study source 10.19. What was the attitude of Eisenhower towards the communist bloc as reflected in the domino theory? How did this attitude affect future U.S. policy towards Southeast Asia? 2. Khrushchev and his policies. In 1953, Stalin died. Khrushchev later became the Soviet leader. He advocated the peaceful coexistence of communism and capitalism. He adopted moderate policies towards the West to prevent a devastating nuclear war. Khrushchev believed that the Soviet Union could compete with the United States in areas like economy, technology, and ideology. Khrushchev also believed that communism was superior to capitalism. It would eventually win over capitalism even without war. B. An overview of the detente. 1. Geneva Summit, 1955. In July 1955, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France held the Geneva Summit. They discussed the issues of global security, American-Soviet peaceful coexistence, armaments reduction, and so on. Though no concrete resolutions on armaments reductions were achieved, the summit marked a meaningful attempt at American-Soviet dialogue. Look at the source 10.20. Khrushchev proposed peaceful coexistence. The first detente of the Cold War occurred. History Extra. Open skies. At the Geneva Summit, the United States proposed open skies, which would allow American and Soviet spy planes to mutually observe the carrying out of disarmament. The Soviet Union rejected the suggestion. In 1992, the United States, Russia, and 30 other countries eventually signed the Treaty on Open Skies. According to the treaty, signatories should inform the other party before conducting an armed aerial reconnaissance. 2. Mutual visits between the leaders of the two countries, 1959. In 1951, both the United States and the Soviet Union held exhibitions in the other's capital to promote trade and cultural exchange. American Vice President Nixon visited the Soviet Union in July. Khrushchev visited the United States in September. Cold War tensions eased. History in depth. Propaganda war in the kitchen. In July 1959, the American National Exhibition was held in Moscow. It displayed modern American household appliances, demonstrating American prosperity and advanced technology under capitalism. Nixon and Khrushchev were invited to the exhibition. Khrushchev claimed that Soviet superiority was shown in its military, while Nixon promoted the American belief in peace. Nixon further criticized the Soviet Union for its lack of daily necessities. This kitchen debate became an iconic ideological propaganda war of the Cold War era. Look at the source 10.21. Ideological debate between Khrushchev and Nixon, above. However, they agreed to compete peacefully. Khrushchev later became the first Soviet leader to visit the United States, below. 3. 1960-1971. Continuation of the Cold War. The U-2 incident in the 1960s ended the American-Soviet detente. Afterwards, they had conflicts over many international issues which nearly caused a devastating nuclear war. The United States once again intervened in local conflicts to stop the expansion of communism in Asia by force. A. U-2 incident, 1960. 1. Background and development. Since 1956, American spy planes had been spying on the Soviet Union. In May 1960, the Soviet Union shot down an American U-2 spy plane. Khrushchev demanded that the United States stop all spy flights and apologize, or else he would not attend the Paris summit to discuss armaments reduction. Eisenhower agreed to cancel spy flights but refused to apologize. 2. Impact. The U-2 incident caused the collapse of the Paris summit. The Soviet Union took a tough stance against the United States, and Khrushchev refused to discuss international affairs with Eisenhower again. The first détente of the Cold War ended. Look at the source 10.22. U-2 spy planes could perform aerial spying at an altitude of nearly 20,000 feet. Between 1956 and 1959, U-2 spy planes carried out more than 50 missions over Soviet territory. Look at the source 10.23, a Soviet cartoon about the U-2 incident. From the source. Study source 10.23. What is Eisenhower doing in the cartoon? What is the view of the cartoonist on his spying activity? B. Berlin Crisis, 1961. 1. Background. Germany was divided after the Berlin blockade. West Germany achieved a quick economic recovery, while the development of East Germany lagged behind. Between 1949 and 1961, around 2.7 million East Germans escaped into West Berlin to seek freedom and a better life. This hit the economy and image of East Germany. 2. Development. In 1961, Khrushchev demanded the withdrawal of Western forces from West Berlin. However, American President Kennedy refused. Between June and August, the Soviet Union ordered the East German government to build a wall around West Berlin, separating it from East Germany. The United States strongly condemned the actions of the Soviet Union and East Germany and sent more soldiers to West Berlin. In October, the United States and the Soviet Union sent tank troops to the border between West and East Berlin and confronted each other at a checkpoint. Finally, the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw the tanks along the border. Look at the source 10.24. American and Soviet tanks confronting each other at a checkpoint in Berlin above, and an extract from a speech made by Kennedy in July 1961 below. We cannot and will not permit the communists to drive us out of West Berlin, either gradually or by force. For the fulfillment of our pledge to that city is essential to the morale and security of West Germany, to the unity of Western Europe, and to the faith of the entire free world. 3. Impact. The Berlin crisis further worsened American-Soviet relations. The Soviet Union tore up its agreement about nuclear arms limitations with the United States and resumed nuclear testing. A new round of the nuclear arms race started. The Berlin War became an iconic symbol of the Cold War and the division of Germany and Europe. History headline: The wall isolates East Germans. I flee to West Berlin. August 15, 1961. In August 1961, East Germany started building the 155-kilometer-long Berlin Wall around West Berlin. At the time, the wall was made of barbed wire fences only. On August 15, Konrad Schumann, who jumped over the barrier, became the first East German soldier to cross the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was later strengthened with border defenses such as watchtowers and concrete walls. East German soldiers were ordered to fire upon escapees. However, many East Germans still attempted to flee to West Berlin. They dug tunnels and even took air balloon rides at night. The Berlin Wall was eventually dismantled on November 9, 1989, symbolizing the imminent end of the Cold War. Look at the source 10.25. Konrad Schumann crossing barbed wire at the border above and the Berlin Wall in the 1970s below. C. Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. 1. Background. In 1959, the pro-American regime in Cuba was replaced by Castro's communist government. Castro was pro-Soviet Union. In 1961, the United States supported Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro, but the operation failed. The United States became worried that communism would expand in Central and South America. 2. Development. In 1962, the Soviet Union secretly deployed missiles in Cuba. Most major American cities would be within range. Later, Americans discovered the missile bases. President Kennedy ordered a sea blockade of Cuba and demanded that the Soviet Union withdraw the missiles from Cuba. At first, both the United States and the Soviet Union stood firm. War was about to break out. At last, they reached a compromise. Khrushchev withdrew the missiles from Cuba. Kennedy lifted the blockade and promised not to invade Cuba in the future. The United States also agreed to withdraw the missiles deployed in Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended. Look at the source 10.26. Castro, the communist leader of Cuba. Look at the source 10.27. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 left, and an American patrol plane flying over a Soviet freighter which was heading to Cuba above. 3. Impact. The Cuban Missile Crisis pushed the world to the brink of nuclear war. The United States and the Soviet Union decided to work to avoid serious conflict and agreed to set up a direct communication system between their leaders. In 1963, they signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty to limit nuclear tests. This eased the nuclear arms race. As comics say, Cuban Missile Crisis. Main points of the comics. Why was the Cuban Missile Crisis regarded as the peak of the Cold War? If you were an American living at that time, would you be satisfied with Kennedy's way of handling the incident? 1. In May 1960, the Soviet Union and Cuba established diplomatic relations. Khrushchev wanted Cuba to check the United States, while Castro wanted the Soviet Union to help him consolidate his power. 2. From May 1962, the Soviet Union secretly helped Cuba set up missile facilities. Most major American crises, including the capital, would be within range. From August to October 1962, American President Kennedy collected intelligence on Cuba. 3. On October 22, 1962, in a national broadcast, Kennedy announced that a military blockade of Cuba would be enforced. Other NATO members supported the United States. 4. Khrushchev ignored the blockade and ordered Soviet fleets to advance towards Cuba. An American U-2 spy plane was shot down by a Soviet missile over Cuba. Everyone believed a nuclear war would break out. 5. At the peak of the crisis, Kennedy started secret talks with Khrushchev. Both leaders finally came to an agreement. 6. This nuclear missile crisis is seen as the peak of the Cold War. The world came to the brink of a third world war. It would have been a global nuclear war if either party had lost its calm. Data-based question 2. Aim: to understand American-Soviet confrontation and a nuclear war crisis. Level 3. Interpreting sources and using your own knowledge and understanding. Study the source below and answer the questions that follow. Source A: an American cartoon published in 1962. Source B: Khrushchev's comment on the incident in Source A. Any fool can start a war, and once he's done so, even the wisest of men are helpless to stop it, especially if it's a nuclear war. D. Vietnam War, from 1961 to 1975. 1. Background. Vietnam, a former French colony, became independent in 1954. It was divided into two parts along the 17th parallel. North Vietnam was a communist country founded by Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam was a pro-Western country. 2. Development. Communists founded their Viet Cong in South Vietnam. Supported by North Vietnam, they started guerrilla warfare to overthrow the local government. The United States sent military advisors and economic aid to assist South Vietnam. In 1961, the Vietnam War broke out. In 1964, the United States launched full-scale involvement in the Vietnam War, but it failed to defeat the Chinese and Soviet-backed North Vietnam. In 1973, an armistice was signed. The United States started to withdraw troops from South Vietnam. In 1975, North Vietnam won the Civil War and unified Vietnam. 3. Impact. The fall of South Vietnam reflected not only the further expansion of communism in Asia, but also the failure of the American containment policy. With the huge cost of the Vietnam War, the United States started to adjust its diplomatic policies. It sought to improve relations with the Soviet Union and China, leading to the détente in the 1970s. Look at the source 10.28. The Division of Vietnam and the Vietnam War, from 1961 to 1975. History in focus. American defeat in Vietnam. During the Vietnam War, the United States sent a large number of soldiers to South Vietnam, with 550,000 soldiers stationed there at the peak. After the war, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia became communist countries successively. The Vietnam War killed over 58,000 American soldiers, with over 75,000 wounded. It also cost the United States about $110 billion. The Americans began to doubt whether it was worthwhile to fight against communism at all costs. 1. August 1964. Gulf of Tonkin Incident. Military conflict between North Vietnam and the United States broke out in the Gulf of Tonkin. President Johnson ordered the full-scale involvement of the United States in the Vietnam War. 2. March 1965. American troops arriving in Vietnam. In February 1965, an American Air Force base in South Vietnam was attacked. Johnson ordered a bombing on North Vietnam. In March, 3,500 American soldiers were sent to South Vietnam. 3. March 1968. My Lai Massacre. American soldiers conducted serious war crimes during the Vietnam War. For example, during a siege of My Lai village, American soldiers fired on the unarmed villagers. 4. January 1969. Nixon's Vietnamization. In January 1969, new American President Nixon proposed the policy of Vietnamization. The United States would gradually withdraw forces from Vietnam. The South Vietnamese government would have to carry on the war on its own. 5. April 1970. Peak of anti-war sentiment. In April 1970, Nixon announced that he would send troops into Cambodia to cut off supplies to North Vietnam. Anti-war sentiment grew high in the United States. Conflicts between anti-war protesters and the police occurred frequently. The police even fired on the protesters. 6. January 1973. Signing of armistice. The constant American bombing forced North Vietnam to start ceasefire talks. Eventually, an armistice was signed. The United States started to withdraw troops from South Vietnam. 7. April 1975. Remaining Americans withdrawn from Vietnam. In April 1975, North Vietnamese troops captured the capital of South Vietnam, Saigon. Before the fall of Saigon, the United States withdrew about 1,300 Americans and 5,500 Vietnamese from there by helicopter. Quote, "The television brought the brutality of war into the comfort of the living room. Vietnam was lost in the American living room, not on the local battlefield." View of McLuhan, famous Canadian scholar, on American defeat in Vietnam. Think about it. According to McLuhan, what was the reason for American defeat in Vietnam? Some scholars believe that miscalculations of the containment policy finally led to American defeat in Vietnam. Do you agree? History extended. Historical figures representing different stages in the Cold War. Ho Chi Minh. Dates during the Cold War. Ho Chi Minh was one of the founders of the Communist Party of Vietnam. During the Cold War, he led the Vietnamese in the fight against France, forcing it to recognize the independence of Vietnam. The United States was greatly shocked by the victory of Ho Chi Minh. Therefore, it later decided to intervene militarily in the Vietnam War. However, the American troops were defeated by Ho's guerrilla strategy. Leadership qualities. Ho Chi Minh had outstanding military abilities. He knew well the terrain and climate of Vietnam. He decided to engage in guerrilla warfare and adopted hit-and-run tactics. This military strategy succeeded in defeating the American troops. Huge casualties and military expenditure prompted the United States to reach a ceasefire agreement and to withdraw from Vietnam. Ho also had diplomatic skills. Though Sino-Soviet relations worsened in the 1950s, he actively sought support from both sides. The support from these two communist countries greatly contributed to North Vietnam's victory in the Vietnam War. This showed Ho's diplomatic wisdom. Historical figures representing different stages in the Cold War. J.F. Kennedy. Deeds during the Cold War. Shortly after Kennedy assumed office, the Berlin crisis broke out. He refused the Soviet Union's demand for American withdrawal from West Berlin. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy initially took a tough stance. He finally made concessions that prevented the outbreak of a nuclear war. He also publicly recognized the contributions of the Soviet Union in the Second World War. This eased American-Soviet relations. Moreover, Kennedy proposed the moon landing program. The program aimed to land a man on the moon within 10 years, putting the United States ahead of the Soviet Union in the space race. Leadership qualities. Kennedy was only 43 years old when he took office as president. In spite of this, he was decisive in the face of Soviet threats. In response to the construction of the Berlin Wall, Kennedy sent more troops to Berlin at once. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, he promptly ordered a blockade of Cuba. At the same time, he secretly negotiated with the Soviet Union. He managed to protect the U.S. interests and security. Kennedy's moon landing program showed his farsightedness. He said, "We choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard." The program reflected the determination of Americans as well as mankind to conquer the moon. In 1969, American astronauts landed on the moon and took one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. 4. 1971, 1979. The Second Détente. In the early 1960s, a nuclear war nearly broke out between the United States and the Soviet Union. Between 1971 and 1979, the international situation underwent changes. American-Soviet relations and Sino-American relations improved. Cold War tensions eased again. A. An overview of American-Soviet relations. 1. Mutual visits and summit conferences. Between 1972 and 1974, American and Soviet leaders paid visits to each other and held a series of summit conferences. Agreements were signed to strengthen cooperation in space technology, culture, and trade. The United States lifted the embargo imposed on the Soviet Union. The two countries also held strategic arms limitations talks to slow down the arms race. 2. Helsinki Agreement. In 1975, the United States and the Soviet Union led members of NATO and the Warsaw Treaty Organization to sign the Helsinki Agreement. They pledged to respect each other's sovereignty, resolve disputes peacefully, and safeguard human rights. They also agreed to strengthen cooperation in various areas. The agreement promoted cooperation and exchanges between the two blocs and eased Cold War tensions. Look at the source 10.29. The signing of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty 1 in May 1972. B. An overview of Sino-American relations. 1. Ping-pong diplomacy. In the early 1960s, Sino-Soviet relations worsened, providing a chance for the United States and China to improve relations. In 1971, ping-pong diplomacy led to a breakthrough in Sino-American relations. The Chinese table tennis team invited the American table tennis team to visit Beijing. The American team arrived in China. After that, Nixon relaxed travel and trade restrictions on China. The Chinese table tennis team visited the United States in 1972. 2. Normalization of relations. In 1972, Nixon became the first American president to visit China. The two countries normalized their relations. In 1979, they officially established diplomatic relations. The reconciliation between China and the United States further improved the relations between the capitalist bloc and the communist bloc. History in depth. Nixon's visit to China. Nixon's visit to China in 1972 was hailed as the ice-breaking trip of the century. The two countries announced that they would jointly work towards the normalization of relations. In his memoirs, Nixon wrote about the historical significance of this visit. He also mentioned some episodes. For example, his good use of chopsticks amazed the Chinese. Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai once showed him how Mao Tai could be set aflame. 5. 1979-1985. Recurrence of the Cold War. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The détente ended. After that, American President Reagan adopted a hardline attitude towards the communist bloc. Cold War tensions re-emerged. A. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989. 1. Background. In 1978, a communist regime was established in Afghanistan. It was opposed by Muslim militant groups. The communists asked for Soviet support. The Soviet Union then sent troops to Afghanistan in 1979. 2. Development. Though its involvement was condemned by the West, the Soviet Union refused to withdraw from Afghanistan. The United States therefore sent troops to support the Muslims. The war became a stalemate. Eventually, in 1989, the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan. 3. Impact. The United States adopted a series of countermeasures. In addition to supporting the Afghan Muslims, it also imposed sanctions, boycotted the 1980 Summer Olympics held in Moscow, and refused to ratify the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty 2. American-Soviet relations broke down again. Look at the source 10.30. Because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the United States and 64 other countries, China included, boycotted the 1980 Summer Olympics. B. Reagan becoming American president, 1981. In 1981, Reagan became the American president. He implemented a number of tough anti-Soviet policies, including expanding American forces, sending troops to overthrow the communist government in Grenada, providing military aid to anti-communist forces in Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and Angola, deploying latest generation missiles in European countries, launching the Star Wars program, officially the Strategic Defense Initiative. Reagan's anti-Soviet policies worsened American-Soviet relations. The arms limitation talks ended. The Soviet Union reacted strongly to the Star Wars program. This triggered a new round of armaments race. History in depth. The Star Wars program. Reagan's Star Wars program was a space-based anti-ballistic missile program which was designed to intercept Soviet ballistic missiles. Though there were voices of opposition within the country, the American government continued to fund the program. The Soviet Union regarded the program as a threat to its national security. It greatly raised expenditure on weapons research. This further increased the burden on the weak Soviet economy in the 1980s, which paved the way for the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991. Look at the source 10.31. Reagan, above, and an interceptor used to intercept Soviet missiles, below. The Soviet Union believed that this program intended to develop space weapons to attack the Soviet Union. C. End of the Cold War. Guiding questions. How did the Cold War end? What were the factors leading to the end of the Cold War? In the early 1980s, faced with serious governance and economic problems, Soviet leader Gorbachev introduced reforms to save the country. However, the reforms led to the fall of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe and the breakup of the Soviet Union. The Cold War finally ended in 1991. 1. Gorbachev's reforms from 1985 to 1991. A. Background. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union was in a deep economic crisis. Decrease in agricultural and industrial productivity led to shortages of food and daily necessities. Living standards declined. The armaments race and the invasion of Afghanistan increased its financial burdens. The Soviet government also lacked efficiency, and corruption among officials was common. In 1985, Gorbachev became the new Soviet leader. He introduced a series of economic and political reforms to get support from the public and maintain effective governance. Look at the source 10.32. Gorbachev was the youngest leader of the Soviet Union, aged 54 when he took office. At the time, the Soviet Union was facing serious economic problems, below. Living standards declined because food and daily necessities were in shortage. An emphasis had been placed on heavy and military industries, ignoring the development of other economic sectors. The armaments race and the stationing of troops in the satellite states increased financial burdens. B. Reforms. 1. Economic reforms. Perestroika. The Russian word perestroika means restructuring or economic reform. Gorbachev tried to transform the Soviet-planned economy into a market economy. Enterprises were given greater autonomy. State-owned enterprises were allowed to set prices and wages themselves. To cut financial expenditure, the Soviet Union reduced its intervention in and financial assistance to other communist countries. It also withdrew missiles and garrisons deployed in Eastern Europe. 2. Political reforms. Glasnost. Gorbachev proposed the policy of glasnost, which introduced the ideas of liberty and democracy. He gave people freedom of speech and of the press, as well as the right to criticize the government. Gorbachev also introduced open elections. In 1990, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was no longer the sole source of national leadership. People could set up political parties and take part in politics freely. 3. Changes in diplomatic policies. Gorbachev improved relations with the capitalistic bloc. He held summits with American President Reagan and signed treaties about disarmament, scientific and technological cooperation, and economic assistance. In 1990, Gorbachev agreed that East and West Germany could unify, ending the division of Germany. Look at the source 10.33. In December 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev signed a treaty to destroy their medium and short-range nuclear missiles. C. Impact. Gorbachev's policy of glasnost liberated anti-communist voices. Conservatives feared that it would lead to the fall of the communist world. This led to a failed coup in 1991. Externally, Gorbachev eased Cold War tensions. With the signing of disarmament treaties with the United States, the armaments race ended. Moreover, relaxing Soviet control over the satellite states encouraged them to pursue democracy and freedom. This resulted in drastic changes in Eastern Europe. 2. Drastic changes in Eastern Europe. 1989-1991. A. Background. In the 1980s, the economic development of Eastern European countries lagged far behind that of Western European countries. Eastern Europeans gradually lost confidence in communism. They hoped to improve relations with the West to increase trade. Nationalism also revived in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europeans wanted to be liberated from the control of the Soviet Union. Look at the source 10.35. Poles queuing in front of a store in the 1980s. Because of the shortages of consumer goods, queuing at shops was part of the lives of people in Eastern European countries. B. Development. In 1988, Gorbachev agreed to give up Soviet control over the Eastern European communist countries and withdraw troops from them. They were allowed to choose their own political and economic systems. Between 1989 and 1991, non-communist governments were set up in these countries. In 1990, East and West Germany were unified. In 1991, the Warsaw Treaty Organization was dissolved. Look at the source 10.36. The fall of communist regimes in Eastern Europe between 1989 and 1991 above, and East Germans tearing down the Berlin Wall below. Look at the table of events. 1989. 1. A workers' party in Poland won an election. It set up the first non-communist government in Eastern Europe since the Cold War. 2. The Communist Party of Czechoslovakia lost an election. An opposition leader became the new president. 1990. 3. A non-communist regime was founded in Hungary after an election. 4. After a revolution in 1989, a provisional government was set up in Romania. 5. A coalition government was set up in Bulgaria after an election. 6. The Berlin Wall was torn down in 1989. Later, a multi-party government was set up in East Germany. It reunified with West Germany. 1991. The communist government in Albania gave up one-party rule. The last communist regime in Eastern Europe fell. 3. Breakup of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. 1991. A. Background. Gorbachev's reforms were unable to solve the problems in the Soviet Union. The state became unstable. Discontent with the reforms intensified the power struggle among the Soviet communists. People also demanded more freedom and democracy. Starting in 1990, some Soviet republics declared independence from the Soviet Union. B. Course. 1. August coup. August 1991. In August 1991, the conservatives in the Communist Party staged a coup. They set up an emergency committee and sent troops to Moscow. The President of Russia, one of the Soviet republics, Yeltsin, appealed to the people to resist the coup. Soldiers also supported him. The coup failed after 2 days. Look at the source 10.37. On August 19, 1991, Yeltsin appealed to the people to resist the coup. Above, Moscow people took to the streets and captured tanks entering the city. Below. 2. Breakup of the Soviet Union and end of the Cold War. December 1991. The August coup sped up the breakup of the Soviet Union. People criticized the internal party struggles and lost confidence in Gorbachev. The republics in their union declared independence one by one. On December 8, 1991, some former republics of the Soviet Union, including Russia, established the Commonwealth of Independent States. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as Soviet president. The Soviet Union, the leader of the communistic bloc, officially dissolved. This marked the end of the Cold War, which had lasted for nearly half a century. History in depth. Commonwealth of Independent States. In December 1991, 12 of the 15 republics of the Soviet Union joined the newly established CIS. Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia refused to join. The CIS mainly works to coordinate the economic, diplomatic, national defense, and environmental protection policies of its member states. The member states have great autonomy. The CIS is similar to the European Union in nature. Look at the source 10.39. Logo of the CIS and the territory of its member states above. The CIS is headquartered in Minsk, the capital of Belarus, below. History extended. Historical figures representing different stages in the Cold War. Gorbachev. Deeds during the Cold War. Gorbachev carried out comprehensive reforms such as introducing a market economy and open elections, as well as withdrawing troops from Eastern Europe. He also sought to ease relations between the Soviet Union and the West. Gorbachev's policy of glasnost led not only to the fall of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, but also to demands for the independence of the republics of the Soviet Union. The August coup further weakened people's support for the Communist Party. Eventually, Gorbachev resigned as Soviet president after the establishment of the CIS. The official dissolution of the Soviet Union marked the end of the Cold War. Leadership qualities. Gorbachev was an innovative leader. To save the collapsing Soviet economy, he dared to end the planned economy and strict control over the satellite states in Eastern Europe. He also introduced new ideas such as freedom, democracy, and open elections. This helped Gorbachev gain popular support and reduced resistance to reform. Gorbachev was also adaptive in policymaking. He allowed Eastern Europe to get rid of Soviet control peacefully rather than engaging in suppression. After the August coup, Gorbachev was willing to give up his original plan of establishing a new federation. He agreed to set up the CIS to replace the Soviet Union. This avoided a possible bloody civil war. The peaceful breakup of the Soviet Union also contributed to the peaceful end of the Cold War. Historical skills. Trace historical development. Trace means to find how an incident got started, developed, and ended. Major historical events sometimes follow a complicated course across a long period of time. We can better understand their development through the method of tracing. Using the half-century-long Cold War as an example, we can first arrange the events in the Cold War in their chronological order and describe the features of different periods. Then, we can trace the development of the Cold War in different stages. Let's look at the table. From 1946 to 1953. Major events. The Iron Curtain Speech. The US introduced the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. The Soviet Union introduced the Molotov Plan. Berlin Blockade. Establishment of the PRC. Korean War. Features. Start of the Cold War, where communist and capitalist blocs opposed each other. 1953-1960. Leadership changes in the US and the Soviet Union. Geneva Summit. Mutual visits between the leaders of the two countries. 1959. Improved relations between the two blocs. 1960-1971. U-2 incident. Berlin crisis. Cuban Missile Crisis. The US launched full-scale involvement in the Vietnam War. Features. Serious confrontations between the two blocs, which put the world on the verge of nuclear war. 1971-1979. American-Soviet détente and Sino-US détente. The US adopted the policy of Vietnamization and began to pull out from Vietnam. Features. Improved relations between the two blocs. 1979-1985. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Reagan inaugurated as American president. Features. Hostility between the two blocs. 1985-1991. Reforms introduced by Gorbachev. Drastic changes in Eastern Europe. The dissolution of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Features. Improved relations between the two blocs, and the end of the Cold War was in sight. D. International situation in the post-Cold War period. Guiding question. What was the international situation in the post-Cold War period? After the Cold War, the United States became the only superpower and retained its dominant position in international affairs. Meanwhile, there were rising regional forces and emerging economies. They played an increasingly important role in regional and international affairs. The international order was moving towards a multipolar world. As the confrontation between the capitalist and communist bloc ended, devastating wars between powers were unlikely in the post-Cold War period. However, frequent regional conflicts and terrorist activities still posed a threat to world peace. Look at the source 10.40. Table comparing the international situation during the Cold War and the post-Cold War period. Superpowers in Cold War period. The United States and the Soviet Union were superpowers. They dominated international affairs and competed for world leadership. Superpowers in post-Cold War period. The United States became the only superpower and sought to continue its domination in international affairs. Balance of power. Cold War period. Bipolar system. The world was divided into two rival blocs led by the United States and the Soviet Union respectively. Balance of power in the post-Cold War period. Unipolar system. The United States was the greatest military power and had great political, economic, and cultural influence. Moving towards a multipolar world. Regional forces and emerging economies were becoming a new force which could not be overlooked. Threats to world peace. Cold War period. The Communist bloc and the Capitalist bloc confronted each other because of ideological differences and conflicts of interest. The vigorous confrontation between the two blocs triggered many crises and put the world on the verge of a devastating war. Threats to world peace in post-Cold War period. Great wars between the powers were unlikely. Regional conflicts and terrorist activities threatened world peace. 1. Rise of regional forces and emerging economies. In the post-Cold War period, the European Union was set up to promote European integration. At the same time, China and India in Asia were experiencing rapid economic growth. Many scholars believed that these regional forces and emerging economies would continue to expand their influence. A multipolar world was developing. History decoded. Emerging economies. In general, emerging economies refers to countries or regions whose industrial and commercial development is less advanced than that of the developed economies, including Western European countries, North America, Japan, and Australia. However, they are experiencing rapid economic growth and have the potential to become developed economies. In the post-Cold War period, emerging economies such as South Korea, Ethiopia, and Argentina grew fast economically. Among them, Brazil, Russia, India, and China were regarded as the four big emerging economies. They were known as BRIC, a name derived from their initials. They later became the BRICS when South Africa was included. Look at the source 10.41. Initials of the BRICS above and the 5 leaders of the BRICS in 2018 below. A. European Union. 1. European Economic Cooperation during the Cold War. The EU was founded in 1993. Since the start of the Cold War, Western European countries had strengthened economic cooperation. In 1986, member states of the European Community signed the Single European Act. It aimed to establish a single market and carry out more coordinated policies. This removed obstacles to further integration. 2. Development of the European Union in the post-Cold War period. After the signing of the Treaty of European Union in 1992, the EU was established the next year. The EU worked to promote cooperation among its member states and to achieve European integration in different areas. Look at the source 10.42. Main objectives of the Treaty on European Union. Treaty on European Union. Objectives. 1. To change an economic union into a political union. 2. To establish a common decision-making approach and procedures. 2. To establish an economic and monetary union the Eurozone. 4. To integrate EU social policies. 5. To establish EU citizenship. 6. To solve the problem of the distribution of power between the EU and its member states. As the EU deepened cooperation and admitted more member states, the economic strength of Europe steadily increased. In 1999, the euro, the single currency of the EU, was introduced. The EU became the second largest economy after the United States. It also played an important role in international affairs. Europe became active in the international community again. This also contributed to the stable development of the world. After the end of the Cold War, Eastern European countries successively joined the EU, strengthening it as a regional force. The unity of the member states also inspired countries in other regions to carry out economic cooperation and integration. Look at the source 10.43. The symbol of euro, which is inspired by the Greek letter e, the English letter e, which also resembles the e, is the first letter of the word Europe. The EU in 1999. Member states 15. Political system. The member states had different political systems, but all were democracies. Economic strength and international influence. Had a GDP of $9.6 trillion in 1999, second only to the United States. The euro was an important international currency, second only to the US dollar, the currency of the largest economy. The largest regional organization, with a population of more than 500 million, continued to admit new member states. Important diplomatic and trade ally of the United States. Most were member states of NATO. Member states Britain and France were permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations. B. China. 1. Development during the Cold War. The People's Republic of China was one of the few communist regimes in Asia in the 1940s. It had great influence on the communist activities in Asia, such as the Korean War and the Vietnam War. In 1955, China attended the Bandung Conference and started to engage in regional affairs through diplomatic means. In the 1960s, China faced serious economic crisis. The situation became worse during the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976. In 1978, China introduced the policy of reform and opening up, emphasizing economic reforms and opening up to the outside world. It gradually became a regional political and economic force. 2. Development in the post-Cold War period. During the post-Cold War period, the Chinese government introduced bold reforms to develop a socialist market economy. It reformed its state-owned enterprises and opened more inland cities to foreign investment. In the late 20th century, China was the world's fastest-growing major economy, with top-ranked productivity and export volume. It also had advanced aerospace technology and strong military power. Look at the source 10.44. Deng Xiaoping introduced the policy of reform and opening up. He was regarded as the chief architect of China's economic reform, opening up and modernization. Look at the source 10.45. A factory of the U.S. company General Motors in Shanghai in 1999. China worked to promote the political stability and economic development of Asia. It advocated peaceful resolution of disputes. For example, it mediated in the North Korean nuclear crisis many times in the 1990s. China also valued cooperation with international organizations. From 1996, it developed closer cooperation with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in different areas. Moreover, China developed multifaceted diplomacy. It established diplomatic and cooperative partnerships with different countries, including capitalist countries. It also joined the peacekeeping missions of the United Nations. Its international influence increased continuously. Look at the source 10.46. On April 24, 1999, the representatives of North Korea, the United States, China, and South Korea, from left to right, met to discuss the nuclear issue. China in 1999. Political system, socialist system. Economic strength and international influence. Had a GDP of 1.094 trillion US dollars in 1999, ranked 7th in the world. Had a population of more than 1.2 billion, the most populous country in the world. Had a huge market that attracted foreign investment. In 1999, export volume ranked 9th in the world and import volume ranked 11th in the world. Established trade and cooperation partnerships with many countries. The EU was the largest trade partner. One of the permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations. Military expenditure and military power ranked among the top 3 in the world. One of the 9 recognized countries that possessed nuclear weapons. C. India. 1. Development during the Cold War. Since its independence in 1947, India refused to ally with the American or Soviet camps. Between 1950 and 1960, India played a leading role at the Bandung Conference and in the non-aligned movement. It promoted cooperation among the weaker countries and became a new political force among Asian and African countries. India adopted socialism. Compared with other East Asian countries, India's economic growth was relatively slow. In the 1960s, it improved relations with the Soviet Union to increase trade. Its pro-Soviet position caused India to be marginalized in the international community. 2. Development in the post-Cold War period. After the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the economic crisis in India worsened. Therefore, India started economic reforms such as introducing a market economy in 1991. It also carried out economic diplomacy. It opened up its market and focused on exporting high technology. Trade relations between India and the West were strengthened. India's economy developed rapidly after the introduction of economic reforms. Between 1992 and 1999, the average annual GDP growth rate in India was 6.3%. Look at the source 10.47. Indian Prime Minister Rao above and Finance Minister Singh below introduced economic reforms in 1991, leading to India's rapid economic growth at the end of the 20th century. Look at the source 10.48. An Indian merchant using an advanced laptop in 1995. Since the 1990s, India's information technology has developed rapidly. In the 21st century, India has developed the second largest IT industry after the US. In the post-Cold War period, India adopted the Look East policy to develop closer economic and diplomatic relations with East and Southeast Asian countries. By the late 20th century, it had signed economic cooperation agreements with ASEAN countries and Japan. In the early 21st century, India participated in the summit meetings of ASEAN and East Asia. Its economic influence in the region was increasing steadily. Look at the source 10.49. The foreign ministers of Japan, left, and India, right, at a conference on economic cooperation in July 1996. India in 1999. Political system, parliamentary democracy. Economic strength and international influence. Had a GDP of $468.8 billion in 1999, ranked 13th in the world. Had a population of more than 1 billion, the second largest in the world. Became an important emerging market by the late 20th century. Established trade and cooperative partnerships with many countries. China was the largest trade partner. The third largest troop contributor to UN peacekeeping missions. Strove to become a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations. Had an armed force of nearly 1 million personnel, one of the 9 recognized countries that possessed nuclear weapons. 2. Regional conflicts and crises. In the post-Cold War period, regional conflicts and crises continued in many places. The Arab-Israeli conflict, the Yugoslav Civil War, and the Rwandan genocide were typical examples. A. Middle East. Conflicts between Israel and Arab countries. 1. Origin and start of the conflicts. The conflicts between Israel and Arab countries originated over the ownership of Palestine in the Middle East. Both the Jews and Palestinians, Arabs living in Palestine, claimed ownership of Palestine. To settle the long-standing dispute, the United Nations decided to divide Palestine into a Jewish state and a Palestinian state in 1947. The Jews accepted the resolution and founded Israel. The Palestinians believed that the resolution was unfair and rejected it. As a result, 5 wars between Israel and its neighboring Arab countries broke out between 1948 and 1982. At the same time, the Palestinians started guerrilla warfare and terrorist attacks against Israel. Look at the source 10.50. The views of the Jews and the Palestinians about the partition plan for Palestine. Jews. We, the Jews, have longed to re-establish our country. We went through a long period of exile and experienced the Holocaust. We believe that our suffering would end with the re-establishment of a Jewish nation-state. Palestine is a land promised to us by God, and therefore we welcome the UN partition plan. Palestinians. We have lived in Palestine for generations and are the owners of the land. The UN partition plan ignores the fact that our population is larger than the Jewish population and we own more than 90% of the land. Therefore, the forcible division of Palestine neglects our interest and will leave many Palestinians under the rule of the Jews in a Jewish state. From the source. Study source 10.50. What were the differences between the views of the Jews and the Palestinians about the partition plan for Palestine? 2. Development in the post-Cold War period. Peace efforts. In the 1990s, under the mediation of the United States, Israel and the Arab countries signed a number of agreements. In 1993, Israel agreed to withdraw from part of the occupied territories and hand them over to the Palestinians. Continuation of conflicts. The Arab-Israeli conflict continued till the end of the 20th century. For example, Israel refused to return occupied territories to Syria, an Arab country, and most Arab countries refused to recognize Israel. Palestinian extremist groups, led by Hamas, carried out terrorist attacks against Israel. Israel retaliated after being attacked, resulting in recurring regional conflicts. The founding of a Palestinian state remained unsettled. Look at the source 10.51. Hamas is a Palestinian Islamic organization established in 1987. It attacked Israeli civilians and military targets many times. Israeli settlements. In 1967, Israel defeated the Allied Arab military forces and occupied the land allocated by the United Nations to the Palestinians and Syria's Golan Heights. Later, Israel built settlements in the occupied territories. Most of these Jewish settlements were located in the West Bank, inhabited by Palestinians. Though Israel was condemned by the UN, it argued that the land belonged to the Jews originally. The Israel settlements combined issues of land ownership, refugee problems, and national security. They became an insurmountable barrier to the solution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Look at the source 10.52. Israeli settlements at the end of the 20th century. B. Southeastern Europe. Ethnic conflicts in the Balkans. 1. Origin and start of the conflict. Yugoslavia was a multi-ethnic state located in the Balkans. Religious and cultural differences caused frequent ethnic conflicts, including the Croatian massacre of Serbs during the Second World War. After the war, Yugoslavia became a communist federal republic made up of 6 republics. Influenced by the nationalist movements in Eastern Europe, nationalism revived in Yugoslavia in the late 1980s. In June 1991, Croatia and Slovenia declared independence. Serbia intervened militarily. The Yugoslav Civil War began. Look at the source 10.53. Serbian President Milosevic above and Yugoslavia in 1989, right. Milosevic vigorously expanded the rights and influence of the Serbs in Yugoslavia. He used force to maintain the unity of the federation, resulting in a civil war. From the source. Study the source 10.53. What were the features of the ethnic distribution in Yugoslavia? How did such features affect the situation in Yugoslavia? 2. The Yugoslav Civil War, 1991-1999, and its development in the post-Cold War period. Continuation of war. Ethnic cleansing occurred during the war. The battlefield expanded to Bosnia-Herzegovina when it declared independence in 1992. After the intervention of the United Nations and NATO, the war once ended in 1995. In 1998, Kosovo, an autonomous province of Serbia, fought for independence. Civil wars and ethnic cleansing recurred. In 1999, NATO bombing forced Serbia to withdraw troops from Kosovo, and Kosovo agreed not to declare independence. The Yugoslav Civil War ended. Post-war development. As the republics successively gained independence, Yugoslavia gradually dissolved and was officially erased from the map in 2003. The decade-long Yugoslav Civil War resulted in severe destruction, and ethnic cleansing caused heavy casualties. Many people were forced to leave their homes and became refugees. However, ethnic conflicts still continued. The situation in Kosovo was the most unstable. Look at the source 10.54. The Yugoslav Civil War caused heavy civilian casualties. Thousands of people were forced to leave their homes, leading to a serious refugee problem. The pictures show people cleaning up dead bodies, the victims of Serbian ethnic cleansing, left, and refugees from Kosovo fleeing their homes below. C. East Africa. Ethnic conflicts in Rwanda. 1. Origin and start of the conflict. During the colonial period, the Tutsi in Rwanda ruled over the majority Hutu. In 1962, Rwanda gained independence from Belgium and the Hutu took control of the government. Serious ethnic conflict and ethnic cleansing resulted. Many Tutsi fled to neighboring Uganda. 2. Rwandan Civil War from 1990 to 1994 and its development in the post-Cold War period. Course of the Civil War. In 1990, Tutsi militants attacked Rwanda. The Rwandan Civil War started. In 1993, the Rwandan government reached an armistice with the Tutsi militants. It also allowed the Tutsi to join the government, but this caused dissatisfaction among Hutu extremists. In April 1994, the Rwandan president died in a plane crash. The Tutsi and the Hutu held each other responsible for the incident. The civil war occurred and triggered the Rwandan genocide. From April to July, more than 800,000 Tutsi were killed by the Hutu, accounting for about 3/4 of the Tutsi population. Look at the source 10.55. In the Rwandan Civil War, more than 800,000 people were killed in ethnic cleansing, and 2 million people were forced to leave their homes. The pictures show the skulls of victims of the Rwandan genocide above and Tutsi refugees fleeing their homes during the war below. In July 1994, Tutsi militants captured the capital and set up a new government. The civil war ended. Post-war development. The new Rwandan government promoted national reconciliation and allowed the Hutu to share power with the Tutsi. Criminals who took part in the genocide were put on trial. The government also encouraged refugees to come back home. However, many Hutu remained in exile for fear of revenge. Some Hutu extremists continued to fight against the government as well. Look at the source 10.56. After the Rwandan Civil War, more than 50 armed groups remained within the country and on its borders. History in depth. Africa in turmoil. In the post-Cold War period, African countries faced wars, riots, and coups. These were the main causes. There were many ethnic groups in Africa. Cultural and religious issues frequently caused conflict. The borders of many African countries were not defined according to ethnic distribution. Various ethnic groups were often included in a single country. Conflicts within countries were prone to occur. Absolute rule and abuse of power were common among African rulers. Soldiers often staged coups to seize power. Look at the source 10.57. Conflicts in Africa in the 1990s above, and a militant on the border of an African country. Left. 3. Threat of terrorism. In the post-Cold War period, terrorism was another big threat to peace. As the superpower, the United States played the role of world's policeman and actively intervened in regional affairs. Some countries and organizations regarded this as an American hegemonism. Anti-Americanism grew and led to terrorist attacks. A. What is terrorism? According to the United Nations, terrorism is a criminal act intended or calculated to provoke a state of terror in the general public. Terrorist groups usually justify their actions on religious, ethnic, or political grounds. They frequently conduct indiscriminate attacks. B. Terrorist activities in the post-Cold War period. 1. Global terrorist activities. In the post-Cold War period, terrorist activities spread throughout the world. South Asia, East Asia, the Middle East, Western Europe, South America, and North America were all threatened by terrorist activities. There were over 25,000 terrorist attacks in the world between 1991 and 1999. Look at the source 10.58. The number of terrorist incidents, deaths, and injuries worldwide during the post-Cold War period. Look at the source 10.59. In 1998, Al-Qaeda, an Islamic organization, bombed the United States Embassy in the capital of Kenya, causing serious damage and killing more than 200 people. 2. 9/11 attacks in the United States. The United States had been involved in the Middle East since the Cold War. It supported Israel in the Arab-Israeli conflict, see pages 164-165, and intervened in Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990-1991. Anti-Americanism grew in some Arab countries and extremist Islamic groups. In the post-Cold War period, the United States strengthened its strategic deployments in the Middle East. The extremist Islamic groups began to launch terrorist attacks against it. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda hijacked planes and crashed them into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in the United States. About 3,000 people were killed. This incident was known as the 9/11 attacks. C. International efforts against terrorism. Nations cooperated to combat terrorism. The United Nations required member states not to finance, engage in, or tolerate terrorist activities. The international community also strengthened cooperation in exchanging information, combating the illegal arms trade, and cutting off the sources of funding of terrorist groups. These measures aimed to weaken their ability to launch terrorist attacks. Look at the source 10.60. 2 planes crashed into the World Trade Center during the 9/11 attacks above. After this incident, the United States launched the War on Terror with the goal of eliminating terrorism, including the war in Afghanistan below in 2001 and the Iraq War in 2003. History in depth. Islamic State. Rise of the Islamic State. After the 9/11 attacks, the United States launched the War on Terror in the Middle East. However, it failed to eliminate terrorism. More extremist Islamic groups were founded, aiming to expel the United States from the Middle East. The Islamic State was one of these extremist groups. The Islamic State was originally based in Iraq. It expanded to Syria in 2011 and announced its official establishment in 2014. At its peak, the Islamic State controlled 210,000 square kilometers of territory. Decline of the Islamic State and the political situation in the Middle East. The Islamic State had conducted terrorist attacks worldwide and threatened global security. In 2018, it was attacked by the Allied troops, including the United States and Russia, and gradually declined. During the American bombing, the Syrian government asked Russia for help, making the regional political situation more complicated. In the post-Cold War period, American hegemonism induced the rise of the Islamic State. Later, the Islamic State indirectly provoked a US-Russian confrontation in Syria that echoed their strife during the Cold War. Look at the source 10.61. Armed militants holding the flag of the Islamic State. The group treated hostages and prisoners cruelly. Look at the source 10.62. Situations in Syria and Iraq in early 2018. Data-based question 3. Aim: to understand the international situation in the post-Cold War period. Level 2. Interpreting sources and using our knowledge and understanding. Study the source below and answer the questions that follow. Source: adapted from the New York Times, November 9, 1991. Since it could not stop the attacks by the Serbs, the 12 member states of the European Community decided to impose economic sanctions on Yugoslavia and urged the UN Security Council to adopt an oil embargo to cut off its supply. They were the most severe measures that the community had enacted since its involvement in the Yugoslav conflicts, triggered by the independence of 2 Yugoslav republics. The community pointed out that although these punitive measures were imposed on Yugoslavia, They only targeted Serbia and the Serbian army in Yugoslavia. Those republics which cooperated with the community would receive compensation. Concept consolidation. Background and causes of the Cold War period. What was the Cold War? Tense relations and confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union from 1946 to 1991. The United States led the capitalist bloc while the Soviet Union led the communist bloc. No direct war broke out between the two blocs. Background: Rise of the New World Order. Decline of traditional European powers. War damage and casualties, decline in production and foreign trade, war debts and reparations. Rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers. Causes: American-Soviet confrontation. Ideological differences, long-standing mistrust, wartime differences, post-war confrontation. 1946-1953. Outbreak and early development. 1946. Iron Curtain speech. 1947. Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, Molotov Plan. 1948-1949. Berlin Blockade. 1949. Establishment of the People's Republic of China. 1950-1953. Korean War. Focuses: Formation of rival economic and military organizations. The Cold War spread to Asia. 1953-1960. The first Dayton. It focuses on American and Soviet leaders held summit conferences and paid mutual visits. 1960-1971. Continuation of the Cold War. 1960. U-2 incident. 1961. Berlin crisis. 1962. Cuban Missile Crisis. 1961-1975. Vietnam War. Focuses: The world was pushed to the brink of a nuclear war. The United States adjusted its foreign policy after its setback in the Vietnam War. 1971-1979. The Second Détente. Focuses: The United States and the Soviet Union improved relations. China and the United States improved relations. 1979-1985. Recurrence of the Cold War. 1979-1989. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. 1981. Reagan becoming the American president. Focuses: Long-term military intervention and the armaments race weakened the economy of the Soviet Union. 1985-1991. End of the Cold War. 1985-1999. Gorbachev's reforms. Economic reforms. Perestroika. Political reforms. Glasnost. Changes in diplomatic policies. 1989-1991. Drastic changes in Eastern Europe. 1991. Breakup of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Focuses: Gorbachev's reforms failed to solve the serious economic and governance problems. The reforms led to drastic changes in Eastern Europe and sped up the breakup of the Soviet Union. After 1991. International situation in the post-Cold War period. Emergence of regional forces and the emerging economies. European Union, a regional force that promoted the integration of Europe. China and India, emerging economies in Asia. Regional forces and emerging economies became influential. Regional conflicts and crises. Middle East, conflicts between Israel and Arab countries. Southeastern Europe, ethnic conflicts in the Balkans. East Africa. Ethnic conflicts in Rwanda. Regional conflicts caused great damage and casualties and refugee problems. Below, Arab-Israeli disputes and conflicts continue to this day. Threat of terrorism. Terrorism. A criminal act intended or calculated to provoke a state or terror in the general public. Terrorist activities spread throughout the world, such as 9/11 attacks in the United States in 2001. The international community cooperated to combat terrorism. A global outlook. Timeline of events. 1946. Churchill made the Iron Curtain speech and the Cold War started. Chinese Civil War started. 1947. The Soviet Union proposed the Molotov Plan. The US proposed the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. India declared independence from Britain. 1949. Berlin blockade ended. NATO was founded. Chinese Civil War ended, and the PRC was founded. 1953. Khrushchev became the leader of the Soviet Union. Eisenhower became the American president. Korean War ended. 1955. Warsaw Treaty Organization was founded. 1959. Khrushchev visited the US. 1960. U-2 incident occurred. 1961. Berlin crisis occurred. Vietnam War started. 1962. Cuban Missile Crisis occurred. Rwanda declared independence. 1963. Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty signed. 1964. The U.S. launched full-scale involvement in the Vietnam War. 1971. China and the U.S. engaged in ping-pong diplomacy. 1973. American full withdrawal from Vietnam. 1975. Helsinki Agreement signed. 1979. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. 1981. Reagan became the American president. 1985. Soviet leader Gorbachev introduced reforms. 1989. Eastern Europe underwent drastic changes and communist regimes began to collapse. 1990. Rwandan Civil War began. 1991. The Soviet Union broke up and the Cold War ended. 1993. The EU was founded. 1994. Rwandan Civil War ended. 1999. Yugoslav Civil War ended. 2001. 9/11 attacks occurred. Russia in the post-Cold War period. In 1991, Russia became an independent sovereign state. It inherited most of the territory of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union's seat in the United Nations. During the rule of President Yeltsin from 1991 to 1999, Russia still faced a serious economic crisis owing to his radical market reforms. The situation gradually returned to stability in the early 21st century. Today, though Russia is no longer considered a superpower, it still has great military force and political influence.